So I had a really interesting exchange this morning with a counter apologist on Twitter about objective morality, and I wanted to share that conversation with you all here so we could debrief it. So let's take a look at our tweets. So I'm going to begin by giving some background. So I had posted yesterday, the childish braggadocio may be uniquely Trump with respect to this tweet from Trump below. But the entitlement that the USA lives by a different standard and has a right to invade other countries and assassinate their leaders is just post World War II American realpolitik. Okay, don't worry about that. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. It's not really the point of the video here. I just wanted to provide that as the context for counter apologist then responding. So, counter apologist then said this. I don't think he's arguing we have a right to do that, only that we can. I'm not saying we should. That is to engage in assassination of the Iranian leader. He said, as a side note, and now we come to the money line that really launched our conversation. He says, as a side note, if you wanted to see one reason why I think moral non-realism is true, look at how international relations play out. It's all power all the way down. In other words, might makes right in international relations. And if might makes right, then counter-apologist is saying that supports the conclusion that there's no such thing as objective moral facts about which human beings disagree, but rather morality is somehow constructed or relative. Maybe it's constructed in terms of power. So I responded and said, this claim that counter-apologist made essentially that might makes right in international relations. I said, that's not a good reason to be a moral non-realist. So he said, it isn't. The power relation dynamic explains so much of how individuals and societies actually interact. So I gave a couple replies here. The first reply I said is, it's power all the way down is vague, but it's also consistent, and this is really the important thing. It's consistent with objective morality or objective moral values and obligations. For example, a person could believe that this is these dynamics, the might makes right dynamics, are really explained in terms of a particular utilitarian ethic of trying to maximize the good through the exercise of power, both hard and soft power in international relations. So the fact that you see power is this central factor in all international geopolitical relations doesn't entail or support moral non-realism. It's also consistent with objective moral systems. But the second thing I pointed out is this is really what we call underdetermination. In other words, the evidence that is being proffered by counter apologists to support moral non-realism, that morality is somehow subjective or socially constructed or just not objective, that the evidence he's invoking to support that conclusion just underdetermines that conclusion because it can be equally explained as people interacting in a non-moral fashion or an immoral fashion. So the fact, and in fact, I would go a lot further than that and say, look, the fact is that our conversations about the exercise of power are inextricably interwoven with moral realism. If the Nazis had won World War II, we wouldn't say that the fact that they had exercised greater power and ultimately won the war would now baptize all of their actions, including the heinous final solution, as moral simply because they were the most powerful nation. That would be an absurd conclusion. Rather, we recognize that being the most powerful nation doesn't, or winning a war or a battle does not thereby baptize your actions as moral. So we recognize objective morality as we critique the exercise of power in international relations. So that's all part of the second point is this doesn't entail moral non-realism at all. In fact, I think we're of our nature critiquing the actions, the exercise of geopolitical power, which entails or assumes a moral realist position. Then counterapologist says this. If I have a model to explain behavior that doesn't necessitate creating a new category of things that exist and bind us in a weird way, that is, i.e., idem est queerness, why add that on? In other words, if you can explain the world without positing this new category of queer, weird things called objective moral values and objective moral obligations, then why not just explain the world without objective moral values and obligations as some additional posit? That's really a key claim the counter-apologist has made. So that's what I focus on in my response. I then reply like this. Objective moral value is only quote unquote queer, or you could say weird. Now, but by the way, the term queer here is commonly used in to mean strange or unusual within philosophical discourse, just to explain the use of that term. Objective moral value is only queer to the moral psychopath who does not have access to objective moral facts. But for the rest of us who are not clinical psychopaths, we do perceive objective moral value and obligations as part of the basic furniture of the universe, as part of our basic perceptual experience of reality. So for us, I explained, this is a basic feature. It's not something additional that we're positing to try to explain something else. It's just a feature of our experience. I went on to say you might as well claim that the external world is a quote queer postulate and be an idealist. That is a person who believes there is no external world beyond our conscious experience, like no world to which our conscious experience corresponds or which it is experiencing. And that to me is just an absurd conclusion to position to take. Now, there are philosophers who have taken that position. So, for example, George Berkeley, the famous 18th century idealist, he took this position that believing a world, that there is an objective world that exists external to our human perceptual experience, is to make some kind of queer, odd, weird additional postulate. And you can explain reality in a perfectly satisfactory manner simply by explaining it in terms of there are minds and the experiences of those minds. You don't actually have to have an external world that corresponds to those minds, or even a physical body that is attached to the mind, the soul that experiences. But for most of us, that's utterly unpersuasive. For most of us, we would say, obviously, I experience an external world. And if there's anything queer or weird, it is the idealist postulate that there is no world external to our minds and that everything just is minds and their sensory experiences. And by the same token, I would say we just experience objective moral value and obligation as part of the furniture of the universe. And to claim that that is some additional postulate, that is the thing that is queer or weird. Or as I put it here, something that really is the experience of the clinical psychopath, who the very definition of clinical psychopathy includes that a psychopath is somebody who is really morally blind. They cannot see, experience, or perceive through a knowledge of acquaintance basic moral objective facts. So for them, as Robert Hare, the famous uh, psychologist or psychiatrist, I forget which, who analyzed, really developed the psychopathy checklist in the modern era for analyzing psychopathy. He described clinical psychopaths as like people who are colorblind. They cannot see color in the world around them. So for them, uh, color is some weird thing that they don't have direct access to. They don't know what it's like to see a bright red flower. They don't have that experience. What they see would, for them, the flower would be what we would say is phenomenologically like a shade of gray. And for the clinical psychopath, they don't experience the draw and attraction of moral goodness and the revulsion and repelling of moral evil. So for them, they just have a flat black and white and gray landscape. The rest of us have a world of moral color. It's part of our basic experience of the world. It's not queer or weird. So this is now the interesting thing is for reductionists, for philosophical reductionists, they often try to play this card by claiming that something which really is a feature of our basic experience is somehow weird, Daniel Dennett famously or infamously did this with respect to his analysis, his eliminativist analysis of consciousness, right? Trying to reduce consciousness just to brain states or something and claim that consciousness is some weird additional postulate which is queer and implausible. And I would say, no, the thing that's really weird is claiming consciousness does not exist because I'm experiencing it right now. As surely as I'm experiencing anything, I am conscious. So then counterapologist focuses on the fact that I referenced psychopathy. And he says, so J.L. Mackie, who was a non-realist about morality, he says, Mackie was a psychopath. You think I am too? All non-realists? And I want to highlight that and focus on that response for a minute, because in my view, there is, I will say, a bristliness about that, and incredulity and an affrontive edge to counter-apologist's response. He doesn't like being compared to a psychopath. And I think fair enough. The interesting thing is, I think the very fact that he is repelled by being compared to a psychopath is just further evidence for the fact that he himself, in fact, does have a direct experience of objective moral value and obligation. He's he has that experience, and so he's repelled by the comparison between him and a clinical psychopath who has no such experience. And that, in and of itself, is, I would say, further tacit support for moral realism. You know, the idea for the non-moral realist who is not a clinical psychopath, um, when they try to view the experience of or the claim of objective moral facts and obligations or objective moral values and obligations as some queer weird thing, it's like a fish swimming in the water saying, you know, a postulate of water that we move through, that's like some queer weird thing. I think that we can explain all of our experience as fish without positing water. And just as the realist about the external world says, no, the external world just is a feature of our experience. It's the idealist who has a reductivist, implausible, queer explanation. So it is the moral non-realist who has a reductive, implausible, queer explanation. Anyway, finally, I respond to counter-apologist. I said, look, I'm not saying you're like a psychopath or comparing you to a psychopath because I believe you do perceive objective moral facts, you know, values and obligations. I just believe you are deluded in your analysis of them, right? You have a delusion, a false, persistent belief about them by believing they're not objective, by believing they are subjective or socially constructed or what have you. So that was the sum of our conversation. I thought that was really interesting as a conversation, more so than most conversations that I've ever had on Twitter. And in part because Counterapologist is always a good sparring partner, but also because I think that this really does come to some pretty basic assumptions about what counts as queer or weird and what is, in fact, part of our basic experience. And I definitely, in my view, believe that moral value and obligation is part of that basic experience. Now, before I conclude, I just wanted to read for you one of my favorite quotes that I often come back to from Eleanor Stump. I quote Eleanor Stump in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, from her essay, The Mirror of Evil. So I figure it's just as well that I'll quote myself quoting her rather than quote her. So this is from page 81 of Jesus Loves Canaanites, where I'm quoting from Eleanor Stump. She says, it's true that our moral principles and our ethical theories rely on reason. But we build those theories and principles and theories, at least in part, by beginning with strong intuitions about individual cases that exemplify wrongdoing. And we construct our ethical theories around those intuitions. So, what she's describing there is that basic encounter with reality, with moral, objective reality from which we then build our theories, just like we build theories of the external world from our basic perceptual experience of the external world. She goes on, we look for what the individual cases of wrongdoing have in common, and we try to codify those common characteristics into principles. Once the principles have been organized into a theory, we may also revise our original intuitions until we reach some point of reflective equilibrium. So there is some back and forth, a sort of hermeneutical spiral as you're revising your basic original intuitions. They're not infallible, but they nonetheless are the foundation or the starting point for later theorization. And at that point, you want to bring your intuitions that started the whole process into harmony with the theory. But then comes the key point for Stump, at least for this passage. She says, our original intuitions retain an essential primacy. If we found that our ethical theory countenanced Nazi experiments on children, we'd throw away the theory as something evil itself. So the intuitions retain primacy over the theory and are more important than the theory. That's the starting point. It's the same thing when it comes to explaining the ontological nature of moral value and obligation. If your theory entails that moral obligations and values are simply subjective and constructed by, let's say, human social groups or are just a byproduct of emergent evolution, which are justified insofar as they further biological adaptation, then that is a theory which, for example, would entail that Nazi experiments on children is not objectively wrong. And that, I would submit, is a basis to throw away that theory as something evil itself. Because if your theory cannot recognize, your account for moral value and obligation cannot recognize that something like Nazi experiments on children is objectively evil, then you ought to turf that theory. The basic datums, basic data, I should say, of moral experience, moral intuitions, basic encounter with objective moral good and evil is more fundamental than the theory that's going to try to explain it as subjective, socially constructed, reductive, etc. That's the queer thing. That's the weird thing. People that try to develop theories that explain what we know and perceive as objective moral good and evil, to explain it in a way that is reductive and non-objective or subjective, socially constructed. That is the queer thing. That is the weird thing. So those are my thoughts. Very much enjoyed the conversation anyway, and hopefully you found these thoughts to be helpful.